haven't looked at any of the videos that Mitch is producing, you ought to take a look at them because he's going along really, really well. They're looking really great, and I certainly appreciate what he's doing to help us get the word out to our community as well as, I guess, to the world, because it's actually on YouTube and actually to be able to go just not just here but everywhere. And so the message might seem simple or might not seem great, but he's doing a good job with our videos. So I just want to put a kudos out there to Mitch for the efforts that he's doing on these videos. This morning I'd like to talk about how to ruin our influence. Not that I want us to ruin our influence. I certainly don't want that to happen. But I would like to talk about how we can ruin our reputation, how we can ruin our influence, and certainly be something that would be counterproductive to our quest in trying to save souls. Our reputation and influence should be of great value to us. Solomon taught this principle all the way back in Proverbs. In fact, we're going to use Proverbs quite a bit in this lesson this morning. Starting with Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 1, it says, "A good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, loving favor rather than silver and gold." You know, we don't think that way oftentimes. We don't realize how important our name is. And actually, for a Christian, it's very important. Because if we're going to have any opportunities to save souls, we're going to have to be a person who has a good reputation. Because people aren't going to want to follow us or the teaching of the Lord if the person who's bringing the message is a scumbag, is somebody who you can't respect. We're going to have a reputation by which people will be wanting to listen to what we have to say. Now, Christ also taught that principle, that their influence was extremely important in the scripture reading that Mark had just given to us. He was telling them that they were indeed the salt of the earth, that they needed to pay attention to how they come across to people, how they speak, and how they influence people. The companion piece to that is really in Luke, and I'm going to read that. Luke chapter 14, verses 34 and 35, because our influence is similar to salt and light, as the Lord told his disciples. 34 and 35 says, "Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its flavor, how shall it be seasoned?" If your salt loses its ability to flavor, then what good is it? In fact, that's how the Lord continues on. "It is neither fit for the land nor for the dunghill, but men throw it out. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Men throw it out. If you don't have influence, what happens when you try to teach somebody? It is wasted. It's not there. It's not worth anything. And men discard it. That's the idea. Men don't pay attention to it. So if our influence isn't good, we're not going to be able to actually teach people. We're not going to be able to actually do what we need to be doing. Yet, is our influence good? Is our influence appropriate? And that's really what we need to get away or come out with this lesson today. Christ is saying if it's not there, it's not good for anything. And there are a number of ways, honestly, that we could lose our savor, or hide our light, or simply ruin our influence. There are a number of ways that we can do that. We're just going to talk about three this morning, and three that I think that are very important to us in our daily walk with the Lord. First of all, being unreliable is a way that you can be or ruin your influence. Paul himself had to experience a number of unreliable people in his life. We're going to start in Acts chapter 15, where we're going to talk about Mark. In Acts chapter 15 and verse 38, Paul insisted that they should not take with them the one who had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. Excuse me. Mark had deserted them. Mark had left them. And he really did great damage to his influence, because at this particular point in time, Paul needed Mark. And when his need arose, well, then Mark wasn't there. Mark left. and left him kind of in a lurch. And actually, as the Bible explains it later on, Mark actually does restore his influence with Paul. But, you know, for a while, Paul did great damage. Mark did great damage to his own reputation. But it wasn't just Mark who forsook Paul. Actually, you know, if anything bad could happen, it seems like it happened to Paul. Going over to 2 Timothy, we find that Demas forsook Paul as well on an occasion. In 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 10, it says, "For Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica, Crescens for Galatia, Titus for Dalmatia." I don't think the other two had departed or forsaken Paul, but certainly we see that Demas had done so. In fact, apparently he had done so loving the present world. He wasn't interested necessarily in spreading the gospel at that particular point in time. And so, again, Paul was left in a lurch. In fact, you know, a little later in the same chapter, verses 16 and 17, we find out that people forsook Paul. In fact, everyone forsook Paul at his first trial. He says, "At my first offense, no one stood with me, but all forsook me. May it not be charged against them, but the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that the message might be preached fully through me, and that all the Gentiles might hear. Also I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion." So things worked out well for Paul, but he was by himself. He was at trial, and no one stood with him. He was forsaken, much like the Lord was on crucifixion, during crucifixion. It's a sad thing that many people become unreliable. And that is one way that you really can hurt your influence. The Bible warns us about trusting unreliable people. We're going to go back to the book of Proverbs, chapter 25 this time. Proverbs chapter 25, and let's read verse 19. "Confidence in an unfaithful man in the time of trouble is like a bad tooth and a foot out of joint." Now, if you had a toothache, you probably know what he means. He says, confidence in an unfaithful person in a time of trouble is like having a bad tooth or a foot out of joint. I haven't had a foot out of joint, but I suspect it's very painful. And that's the idea. It really hurts. You wouldn't think you abandoning somebody or not being that reliable to your employer is that big of a deal. But it really hurts. Not the person who's unreliable, it hurts the people that are counting on him. An employer who's counting on an employee and they're unreliable and they don't show up or they don't do their job as they're supposed to, that becomes a very great pain or burden upon the employer, because he has to now make allowances, has to replace them or whatever else in order to get the job done. And that's the same thing in our lives. If you're counting on somebody and they're not there when they need to be there, when they said they'd be there, and they leave you in a lurch, well, the unreliable person doesn't really affected by that, but you are. And you are really counting on that person to help you out. In fact, 2 Kings, it says to trust an unreliable person is like leaning on a splintered staff. And again, the idea of causing pain not to the person who's unreliable, but to the person who's counting on them is what's actually mentioned. 2 Kings chapter 18. 2 Kings 18, and let's read verse 21. It says, "Now look, you are trusting in the staff of this broken reed, Egypt, on which if a man leans, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who trusted him." At this time, Pharaoh had a bad reputation. He was unreliable. In fact, he was so unreliable that they're talking about him in terms that he's like a broken staff, a splintered staff. If you put your hand on a splintered staff and leaned into it, do you think it would hurt? Of course it would hurt. And he says that's what it's like to have to deal with Pharaoh in Egypt. Egypt is unreliable. They're not going to come to our aid. And so we really shouldn't go there. And that's what ends up happening. is people choose not to work with unreliable people, and hence we lose our influence if we are that unreliable person. That is, again, why we need to be reliable. We need to be people that can be counted on, and so therefore we have a modicum of influence upon other people so that we can teach them. Would you employ an unreliable person if you knew that he was unreliable up front? Now, many employers do employ unreliable people, but they don't normally find out that they're unreliable until they're after employed. And a lot of times, such people, a lot of times they lose their jobs. Would you marry an unreliable person? A lot of times people rush into marriage. And they find out too late, after they've been married, that, this person isn't very reliable. And it becomes a pain to the spouse, not to the unreliable spouse, but to the other spouse, that have to deal with that kind of personality the rest of their lives. You can't trust them. You can't depend upon them. And you can't even give them responsibility because they are unreliable. They lose their credibility and their influence with others simply by being unreliable. That is certainly one way we can lose our influence or ruin our influence and reputation. Another way, though, is by being unfriendly or being quick-tempered. The Bible also warns us about this. Actually, Solomon warns us about this back again in Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 22, and let's read verse 24. Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man do not go. Make no friendship with an angry man. If the person has a reputation of being angry, don't make friends with that person, if at all you can help it. And there's a good reason for that. Actually, the reason for that comes in the next verse, verse 25. He says, lest you learn his ways and set a snare for your soul. Now, how do you set a snare for your soul just by being a friend to somebody who's angry? Well, you set a snare for your soul because you might, or he might, rub off on you. You don't want to be associated with those who are quick-tempered. You don't want to be like them, because being angry all the time basically means you're not very friendly. And if you fly off the handle all the time, people, well, they have a tendency, as you say, of avoiding you. Again, if we are trying to spread our influence or have a reputation, a good reputation, so that we can teach somebody, how are we supposed to do that if we have a reputation of being angry and unfriendly and people not wanting to come and talk to us about things? Of course, it's counterproductive. Verse 14, or chapter 14, verse 17 also gives us another reason why we really don't want to be associated or make friends with an angry person. And it really is because foolishness and folly rest in the angry. And this is mentioned in chapter 14, verse 17. It says that quick-tempered man acts foolishly, and a man of wicked intentions is hated. Again, we really understand that, don't we? A person who's quick-tempered often does foolish things, does things without thinking because of his anger. And it's much like wickedness. And of course, if it's wicked that he ends up doing, well, people don't like wickedness. I know people embrace all kinds of wickedness, but when wickedness is something that happens to them, they don't like it either. Going to verse 29, same chapter, it says, he who is slow to wrath has great understanding, but he who is impulsive exalts folly. Impulsive being that same idea, quick to anger. Somebody who's quickly unsettled exalts folly. Other words, doesn't think well, isn't rational. He's angry, doesn't think things through, and odds are things he's going to end up thinking or doing are going to bite him. And again, what we're trying to incorporate in this understanding is that we don't want to be that way, because if we are, we're going to ruin our influence and prevent our ability to teach others. No one likes to be around people who fly off the handle. I certainly And if you want to influence others, you really just cannot be angry. You cannot be that way. Chapter 15, verse 1, Proverbs, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. So if you want to get angry, all you got to do is say ugly things, say harsh things. But rather, we should be those who respond with soft answers. Going to chapter 18 and verse 24 of Proverbs, it says, a man who has friends must himself be friendly, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. If you're going to have friends, if you're going to be friendly, you're not going to do that by being angry. You're going to have to show yourself friendly if you're going to have friends. I've mentioned this a number of times to some of my kids when they're upset because nobody will talk to them. Why is that? Maybe you need to spend some time talking to them. And if we trying to be friendly, we certainly don't want to be somebody who is quick-tempered or unfriendly. We want to be the kind of person who is approachable, the kind of person that you would be willing to share information with. In fact, when we talk Bible, we're often talking about personal, intimate relationships or personal, intimate information that is being exchanged because we're talking about sin. We're talking about losing our souls. We're talking about eternal salvation. Things that a lot of people consider very touchy and very personal. And how are you supposed to help those people if you have a reputation already of being an angry, quick-tempered individual, unfriendly individual? Certainly we don't want to be that way if we're going to do anything to help somebody. So we would certainly ruin our reputation by being that way. In John Sidney Harris's book, Why I Am Afraid to Tell You Who I Am, he tells a story of accompanying his friend to a newsstand. His friend greeted the newsman very courteously, but in return received a gruff and discourteous service. Accepting the newspaper, which was shoved rudely in his direction, Harris's friend politely smiled and wished the newsman a nice weekend. As the two friends walked down the street, Harris asked, "Does he always treat you so rudely?" He said, "Yes, unfortunately he does." "And are you always so polite and friendly to him?" He said, "Well, yes, I am." "So why are you so nice to him when he is so unfriendly to you?" He said, "Because I don't want him to decide how I'm going to act. Sometimes we're going to have to work at being friendly. Sometimes people, as we know in this world, are very rude, are very angry, very unfriendly. But that doesn't mean we have to be that way." There's a common saying, or a common wisdom, perhaps, that says there is something wrong with a man as with a motor when he knocks continually. And that is certainly true. There's something wrong in the relationship or the personality of the person who just cannot be friendly. And you know, honestly, if we're going to have any success as Christians, we're going to have to be the kind of people that pay attention to how we are, how we come off. Are we friendly? Are we angry? Are we reliable? Those are very important things that we need to look at and work on if we're not. And the third thing I'd like to suggest to us that would ruin our reputation, or ruin our influence, is having an uncontrolled tongue. In order to influence people, we really need to be people of few words. Going back again to Proverbs, this time chapter 10, let's read 19 and 20. "In the multitude of words, sin is not lacking, but he who restrains his lips is wise. The tongue of the righteous is choice silver, and the heart of the wicked is worth little." In a multitude of words, sin is not lacking. That's interesting. Sometimes if we just babble off at the mouth and we don't consider what it is we're saying, oftentimes we say things that we really shouldn't. We stick our foot in our mouth. We need to be very careful how we communicate. We need to watch our words, not just the word choice, but how it is presented. It's not easy, believe me, because people are so different. And people have a tendency to misconstrue things that you have said one way and have the intentions of it being accepted another way, have no intentions of being rude or crude or anything, but sometimes people take you that way because they want to. We have to be very careful as to how it is we communicate with people. Going over to Proverbs chapter 15 and verse 28, it says, "The heart of the righteous studies how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours forth evil." A wicked individual doesn't really think about what it is he's getting ready to say. An angry person certainly isn't, because he's angry. He's just going to say whatever comes to his mind. But a righteous person, a Christian, is somebody who's going to study how he answers. He's going to think twice before he even speaks oftentimes. He's not necessarily just going to blurt out an answer. He wants to consider how it should be answered. And so the wheels are turning. And again, we mentioned they should be, a Christian ought to be somebody of a few words. Well, not only a few words, but somebody who picks his words and knows what he is saying before he says it, so that it doesn't be received wrong. That's not to say we won't make mistakes. We do, and we always do. But that's how we save our reputation. Because if we just babble off at the mouth, that's uncontrolled. We're not thinking ahead, and we're going to ruin our reputation doing that. So in order to influence people, we've really got to be careful of the words that we use. Going over to the New Testament, let's go over to Colossians. Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6. It says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God." Be anxious for nothing. I think that is wise. Even in our communication with God through prayer, we've got to be the kind of people who aren't concerned, or who are concerned about the things that we say. And we should be thankful all the time for the things that we do for the Lord. And of course, now you're probably looking at me strange because I'm actually reading out Philippians, but it went really well. Colossians chapter 4 and verse 6, it says, "Let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each other." Let your speech always be with grace. And that goes back to the introduction, which we just talked about. The Lord telling his disciples that you need to have your salt savor, your savor of your salt. You need to be considered. You need to be considerate of how you talk to people. And that's what this passage is really telling us. We need to always let our speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each other. You know, experience helps a lot, obviously. And as you get older, you run into more situations, and more situations you run into. You handle some of them well, and some of them you don't so well, and you learn. But that's what we're talking about. We need to have a reputation by which we are a kind of person that's approachable, that we actually are able to communicate in a kind way, in a careful way. James chapter 1 also goes along with this very well, provided I go to James chapter 1. James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. "So then, my brethren, beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God." We talked about that idea about not being angry. Angry person does not produce the righteousness of God. But at the same time, he tells us that we should be the kind of people that are slow, are swift to hear, but slow to speak, and slow to wrath. Again, we need to work on these things so that we don't ruin our reputation. Now, we can ruin our reputation, our heart, and our light in more ways than really we have addressed in our lesson this morning. Have you been a good influence to others? Have you hid your light when perhaps you shouldn't? I'd like you to consider this story in closing. In a terrible accident at a railroad crossing, a train smashed into a car and pushed it nearly 400 yards down the track. Though no one was killed, the driver of the car took the train company to court. At the trial, the engineer insisted that he had given the driver ample warning by waving the lantern back and forth for nearly a minute. He even stood convincingly and demonstrated how he had done it. The court believed his story, and the suit was dismissed. "Congratulations," the lawyer said to the engineer when it was over. "You did superbly under cross-examination." "Thanks," he said, "but he sure had me worried." "How's that?" the lawyer asked. "I was afraid he was going to ask if the lantern was lit." So, humorous as it is, and we're talking about in the old days when they had lanterns and had trains where the conductor actually had to get outside the train and wave the lit lantern light. But the reality is oftentimes we're kind of that way in life. We go through the motions and we wonder, why isn't that person responding? Maybe it's because we've lost our light. We've lost our salt. We lost our savor. We lost our influence. We're not really, we might be going through the motions, but because of our reputation, because we have lost our influence, it's not being communicated. The people aren't hearing. They're ignoring. They're just blowing it off because of that influence and that reputation that was lost. So really, the moral is when you're trying to influence people, make sure that you have your lamp lit. Make sure that you have a good reputation. Make sure that you haven't lost your salt, your light. Don't let your light go out by being unreliable, by being unfriendly, by being quick-tempered, or having an uncontrolled tongue like we talked about. Don't let your light go out that way. Watch those things. We are and should be aware of those things. Otherwise, others may not pay any attention when we are trying to influence them for good. And a lot of times that does happen, and we wonder, why is it that you won't respond? Of course, there could be other reasons, but one reason might be because our influence is shot. Let's go to Proverbs, one last passage. Proverbs chapter 4, verse 18. "But the path of the just is like the shining sun that shines ever brighter unto the perfect day." The path of the just, their light shines brighter as they go through life. Your reputation might not be much of anything as a teenager. But as you grow and you reinforce that reputation by being righteous and doing good things, your light becomes brighter and becomes more bright, as he says, unto that perfect day, unto that final day, in which we will all stand before God. We will have to have a good, bright light if we're going to do any good in this world. We cannot afford to ruin our reputations. That's to say that if we have, that it can't be recovered, as Mark has demonstrated to us with Paul. He recovered his bad reputation by doing the right things, and that's what we were going to have to do. And certainly what I admonish us today to do is not to let our lamps go out by being unreliable or unfriendly or quick-tempered or uncontrolled with our tongues, but rather to be the kind of people who recognize how important that is and to control those ideas, control our tongues and our temper and our personality so that we will have a good influence when we talk to people about the Lord. So do not go about life waving an unlit lantern. Make sure the light is out there. It's bright and people can see it. If by chance you need our prayers, we'd be glad to pray along with you as we stand and sing the invitation song.